When he pulled the trigger, the gun did not do what he had been told it would, did not make a funny joke. Instead, it killed the man Fisher, who had told him. He couldn't remember now, not for a certain, not after all he'd been through, and he wasn't entirely sure that it had been someone outside of him. There were voices inside of him as well, and these were the voices that at times he could not help but listen to. But no, this had been, he was sure, an outside voice, or not sure exactly, but almost sure, nearly sure. Jinsey was an outside voice, so was his mother, but his mother, now that she was gone, had become an inside voice too. And Jinsey, when he was all away from him, could become an inside voice as well. How it was he to keep it all straight? But still, Istvan was pretty sure that the voice that had given him the gun had been an outside voice, not an inside one. He had been more than pretty sure until the gun had gone off, and instead of spraying red dye like it was supposed to, had blown apart the man Fisher's head. Who was the man Fisher? He didn't even really know, just a man that someone inside of him or outside of him wanted sprayed with red dye to humiliate him. A kind of joke, the voice had explained to him. No, it must have been an outside voice. He remembered seeing a body along with it. There had been a man with a pale face, missing most of his hair. He had spoken with him for a while, and Istvan had been fed by him, and it had gone on for days perhaps, or longer than that. The voice attached to the man asked questions, little needles sticking into his skin, and then the man nodding when Istvan answered them in a way he liked, and gently or roughly teaching him other answers when Istvan answered in a way that he did not like. And it had been through their conversation that his purpose had developed. It wasn't like the voice was exactly telling him what his purpose was, more like he was coming to it on his own, but he had to admit now that he had time to think that the voice had been like a funnel, directing him, guiding him in, slowly narrowing out of other possibilities, like those chutes in the videos. You drive cattle down just before you shoot them in the head with a bolt gun, or pigs. Was the voice outside or inside? That was the question now. If it was inside, it would come back and he would talk to it, try to understand what had gone wrong, what he had done wrong, why he had managed to kill the man Fisher instead of fulfilling his purpose. If the voice was outside, then it was a trickier question. It might come back or it might not. There was no way of saying, and voices outside, he knew from long experience, were not always direct, not always honest. They would say things they didn't mean. Voices inside weren't like that, not usually anyway. Where was he now? For a while he had been in a sack, where his head had been in a sack anyways. His arms and legs had been tied and were slowly going numb. And then a bunch of men wearing uniforms had appeared and put his head in a sack. It reminded him of what they used to do with horses. He had read about it as a way to calm them when they had to go past something difficult or impossible like a fire. They put their heads in bags and then they couldn't see enough to get frightened. Did they think he was frightening of what horses also would eat food out of a bag hanging from their faces? But that wasn't exactly the same thing since the whole head wasn't in a sack. I'm like a horse, he had thought, though it was hard to think that with his arms and legs tied behind his back, you couldn't do that with a horse, he thought, unless you broke their limbs and floated them back the wrong way. That would kill the horse probably, at very least cripple it, and that made him feel like maybe they had done that to him, had broken his legs and limbs, and so he began to struggle. The inside of the bag smelled like sweat, and then suddenly there were hands on him, hands all over him, and they were lifting him up and carrying him away. He was in a vehicle. He could tell by the way the floor he was lying on was rumbling and by the time hum of the electric motor. Then someone sat him up and leaned him back against something and cut the straps holding his wrists together, and he began to chafe his hands to bring the feeling back. Someone too, maybe the same someone, cut the straps on his legs, and feeling also began to come back there. He started to reach up to remove the sack that was over his head, but someone grabbed his hands and pushed them down. No, a voice said, "Don't touch it. Leave it on." He was pretty sure it was an outside voice, but since all that he could see was the inside of the sack, how could he be absolutely sure? He decided in any case to listen to it, to do what it said. They were in the vehicle for what felt like a long time, maybe not all that long, a voice inside his head suggested, but no, he had to disagree. It was a long time. Then the vehicle stopped. For a while he just sat there listening to muttering voices around him and inside of him, and then there was the sound of metal scraping, and rough hands had grabbed him and were helping him to his feet and then pushing him out. He almost fell while leaving the vehicle, but they were there to catch him. For a moment he could hear the sound of the dome, and he could see the light, a hint of it through the weave of his sack. But quickly they were in another space where it was quieter. Enclosed. Where are we? He asked, but maybe his voice was muffled by the sack because they didn't answer. Nobody answered him, though whoever was holding his right arm did at least tighten their grip. A clattering sound as he was propelled forward, his shoes now on a different sort of flooring, something silk and hard, and then was abruptly jerked to the right. He knocked against something that must have been the side of a doorway, and then hands were pushing on the tops of his shoulders, and it took him a moment to realize that they were trying to get him to sit. Why don't they just say sit, he wondered, like they would to a dog. Why aren't they talking? Slowly he lowered himself down until he found something solid beneath him, and then relaxed into it. A few minutes there was the noise of bodies moving, a tramping back and forth in the space around him, the sound of breathing, the scrape and scuff of boots against floors, all of it slightly dampened by the fabric surrounding his head. Then slowly It faded, all of it moving away and retiring to a safe distance. A door slowly closed and noise became silence, apart from the sound of his breath within the sack. He sat there waiting. Was he alone? He didn't know, but suspected so. For a moment he held his breath and listened, but still heard nothing. What, he wondered, should he do? Carefully he lifted one hand to the sack, felt his face through it, waiting for a hand to come, and pushed his hand down and away. When it did not, he slowly pulled the sack off his head. He was facing into a corner not more than a foot or so away from each wall, like a schoolboy being punished. First horse, then dog, then schoolboy, he thought. I'm evolving, he rumbled his face, then slowly turned. Behind him was a stretch of open floor, then a large table, on the other side of which sat a small gray man. The man was motionless, just watching him. When he saw that Istvan had noticed him, he smiled. Come, pull your chair closer, he said, and patted the table. Why should I? Asked Istvan. Why shouldn't you? The man responded, and Istvan, having no ready response to this, considered for a moment and then pulled his chair to the table. Do you know what you've done? Asked the small gray man. Why are you gray? Asked Istvan. Excuse me, why are you gray? That's not a normal color. Are you real? Are you the Shadow Man? Do I look gray to you? Istvan nodded. Interesting, said the man. I don't know if it's a normal color or not. I don't know how you typically see things. I've always thought of myself as having a normal color, and yes, I am real. Istvan nodded again and stared at the table. What about you? Asked the gray man. Do you think of yourself as real? Me, said Istvan, surprised. Of course I'm real. Why wouldn't I be? That's good, said the man, and smiled. Then both of us being real, we can speak seriously. About what? About what you did. Istvan folded his arms. I don't think it went right, he said. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. No, how was it supposed to happen? He wasn't supposed to get hurt. Are you sure? No, Istvan realized he wasn't sure. That was what was troubling him. Maybe the man Fisher was supposed to get hurt. Maybe he had been tricked, or maybe he had simply misunderstood. Not knowing what to answer, he simply didn't answer. He looked up, and the gray man was still there across the table, watching him with unblinking eyes. You'll be with us for a long time, said the gray man. Why? Asked Istvan. Because of what you did, said the gray man. You killed someone. Not only that, you ended up killing someone political. You assassinated him. He was only a councilman, but he was important in other ways, important to us. That means you belong to us now. To me? Istvan felt anger rising in him. I don't belong to anybody, he said. It's just a figure of speech, said the gray man, affably. What I mean is that you are now an enemy of the state. We have to understand what you did and who convinced you to do it. We know you didn't plan this yourself. We're eager enough to understand that we'll use any means necessary to have our answers. I won't tell you anything, said Istvan. Why should I? The gray man smiled. We're patient, he said. We don't need the answers right away, but eventually you will tell us everything we want to know. Istvan shook his head and waited for the gray man to disappear, but he didn't disappear. You're not real, Istvan claimed. We already agreed I was real, said the man. Did we? Asked Istvan, or was that someone else? The gray man smiled. I like you, Istvan, he said, and then a moment later everything around Istvan started to go strange. the light changing, going bloody, the gray man started to fold himself up. First he folded one arm up and then the other arm, and then he bent in the middle of the back and folded backward. When he was done, he was nothing but a strange gray square lying flat in the chair. Estevan reached across the table and picked it up. Open it, a voice inside him was saying, and so he did, slowly unfolding it until it had become a man again. He set it up in the chair and then took a step back to look at it. When he did, the light went back to normal. It was a man, all right, only it wasn't the gray man. It was a man in a uniform and with a red face, and from the face was coming a voice that was yelling. When it stopped for a moment so that the man could draw his breath, Estevan stuck his hand out. I'm Estevan, he said. Put it there. He closed his hand around the man's hand and shook it, only it wasn't a hand at all, but a neck. As it turned out, the man's neck abruptly, he was lying on the ground with other people's hands on him, holding him down. What have I done? He wondered. What's wrong with me? He was like that for a while, and then they hauled him up and set him in the chair again. This time they tied his hands to the arms of the chair. There were more men in the room, one, two, either side of him. In fact, the red-faced man was still there, sitting on the other side of the table now and rubbing his neck, looking a little frightened. What about you? Asked Estevan. Are you real? What's wrong with you? The red-faced man said, which was enough to make Estevan think that, yes, this man was real, since he had heard that very question posed to him so many times before by people who actually were real. He and the red-faced man talked for a long time. The red-faced man had a lot of interest in the politician and what had happened to him and why Estevan had shot him. He seemed to want to ask the same questions again and again in slightly different ways. Each time a question was asked, Estevan did his best to answer, but the man never seemed satisfied. Who told you to do what you did? The red-faced man might ask, and Estevan would answer, they did. Who are they? The man would repost. The ones who told me, Estevan answered quite truthfully. He went on and on like that, sometimes very much like a merry-go-round, sometimes like other rides at the carnival rides Estevan had never ridden, but which he had seen videos of. He wished he could ride them. They might be fun. As long as he could think about carnival rides, it did not bother Estevan to have this conversation, but it seemed to bother the red-faced man, and he would get very angry and lean over the table and sometimes shout into Estevan's face. This shouting, too, he could think of as a carnival ride in a way, as long as he thought hard enough. After a while, the red-faced man got so irritated with him that he threw up his hands and left. Estevan was on his own, sitting in the chair, waiting. He did not mind being on his own, even preferred it in a way. So he just sat there. There was somewhere deep in his head a slow, staticky sound that he could listen to, and so he listened to it, wondering if he would begin to hear the inside voices hiding in the static. That sometimes happened to him, but no, he did not hear voices, just the static. It was soothing, relaxing, and for a while he forgot where he was. When he remembered where he was again, the red-faced man was back, shaking him, this time yelling again. Then he picked Istvan up by his shirt and lifted him off the chair and let him go so that he fell sprawling on the ground. Istvan lay there, confused, looking up at him, wondering why the man had done that to him when all he had been doing was just sitting, minding his own business. "Get up," the man said. "Why?" wondered Istvan. "I'm fine where I am." He laid there a while longer, just staring at the man. "Get up," the man repeated, and gave him a kick in the ribs. "This man is not your friend," a voice told him. It was an inside voice he knew, because he could tell that the red-faced man did not hear it too. It was a voice just for him. Voices like that, voices just for him, made him feel special. "Not your friend," the voice repeated. "He's not," he said. The man standing above him creased his brow in confusion. "No, he's not. In fact, he's your enemy. You need to get rid of him." "Rid of him? How?" The red-faced man had taken a step back. "Who are you talking to?" "Start by getting up. Sit back in the chair. I'll tell you what to do." It was good to have a voice with him. It was good, especially when the world around him was confusing and he didn't know what to do. The voices seemed to know more about the world than he did, even if sometimes they told him to do things that later he wasn't certain he should have done. But yes, he would listen to it. Slowly he pulled himself around, stood up, then went into the chair. "There, that's better," said the red-faced man. "No," said the voice, "it isn't. But we will make it better." "Yes," said Istvan. He was talking to the voice, but the red-faced man thought he was talking to him, and so he nodded. "Good," the man said. "Now, are you ready to tell me what happened?" "Tell me." "Yes," said the voice. And now the voice was no longer feeling like it was inside him exactly. It was more than that somehow. He was beginning to see now a shadow shape forming there right next to the red-faced man. Not a body exactly. It would never be a body. But he knew from past experiences that eventually it would be like a body. It was like his vision was slowly adjusting so that it could begin to see what was really there. He smiled. "Yes," he said. "Good," said the red-faced man. "Let's start at the beginning. Who were you working for?" The shadow shape was now more or less human, though still a little blurred around the edges. He watched as the shadow man put its hands around the red-faced man's throat and pretended to choke him. The red-faced man didn't seem to notice. Then the shape turned to Istvan and nodded encouragingly. Now you, it said. In an instant he had sprung out of his chair and thrown himself across the table, knocking both the red-faced man and his chair backward. The man gave a startled cry, and then his head struck the cement floor and his body was suddenly loose. Istvan clamped his fingers around the man's throat and squeezed. "Yes," said the shadow man, now kneeling beside him, an awful smile on its blurry lips. "Do it harder." And then the door burst open and other hands were on him, tearing him off, dragging him away.